is not something where you absolutely have to sit in your seat the whole time. It's not school, so we recognize you've all had long days already. So if you're hungry, there is food at the back. The fabulous Marie Lafer and Cynthia Soley have provided us tons and tons of food. There's soup and veggies and cookies. So if you're hungry at any point, don't feel like you have to wait until the break to do that. But we will have a graceful exit for those of you that are only staying the first 2 hours at 7 o'clock. So we'll take a little stretch break as a group at that point. So with all of that, I'm going to also thank the fabulous Erin Duncan. I'm not sure if she's here or she's still running around doing everything. She's an attorney at my office, and this has really been her brainchild, and she has done all of the work on this. So wherever she is, thank you to her. So anyways, Lauren, take it away. Thank you all for coming. It's very exciting to have this many people in the community that are interested in doing this kind of work. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Lorena, and thank you to all of you for coming tonight. I know there's a lot of anxiety in a lot of different places that I've been traveling to lately with this change in administration. And knowing your rights, knowing what the law is, what your rights are when you're interacting with police or government agencies. You may never get arrested. You may never want to get arrested. But having a firm understanding of your rights allows you to really exercise your rights. And in times of government repression and in times when there may be forces at work to try to shrink our rights, it was a really important time for people to, really be able to exercise them. If we don't use them, we lose them, as the saying goes. And so this training that I was asked to give today is sort of a little bit focused on know your rights for activists, whatever your stripe of activism may be. But it also covers your basic fundamental rights, like what happens when you get pulled over for speeding? What are your rights when you're interacting with the state? It is usually about a 1 hour PowerPoint, sometimes a little longer than that, depending on how the flow goes and questions and stuff like that. I would ask, if at all possible, to hold your questions to the end, because probably I'm going to answer it in a slide or two down the road. But if there's any questions about a vocabulary term or there's a phrase that I use that is not understandable, please feel free to raise your hand and I will make sure and answer that. Bathrooms are over here on the right, in case you didn't already know that. On the back table, I brought up a bunch of outreach materials, and just to go over them in case anybody does have to leave early. We have a bunch of Know Your Rights brochures in both English and Spanish. So if you have anyone that couldn't make it tonight, or one of the things we're going to talk about are these magic words that I want you to memorize, and this brochure contains your magic words. Like I said, we also do have it in Spanish if you work with immigrant communities or have non-English speakers in your world. If you know anybody with transdermal piercings, which we'll talk about in the training, but for those of you that don't know, there's the piercings like this that you can take out yourself, but then you may have seen, younger people with like a thumbtack-looking thing in their cheek. That's called a transdermal piercing. We'll talk about why that's different and why we have a whole little Know Your Rights brochure for that. We also have scripts. So if police or government agents show up at your door and want to search your office or your home, we have a little script of what you can legally say to them to protect your privacy rights. We'll talk about that a little bit more. There's a few other things back there as well. Finally, this PowerPoint that I am going to go through tonight with you, along with a video of me giving this training, are all available on our website, which is cldc.org. It's in English and Spanish, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes unless you like to do that, because the slides will be accessible to you. And that is our contact info. As Lorena mentioned, I'm one of the attorneys and the executive director of the Civil Liberties Defense Center. We're based out of Eugene. For 19 years now, we've been primarily doing activist defense around the country. I am currently one of the lead attorneys with the Water Protector Legal Collective out in North Dakota for Standing Rock. I'm one of the lawyers that just filed the class action lawsuit against the police out there for one of the actions. And we've represented about 5,000 activists for free at this point. We've probably trained about 10,000 people on this training, both just giving it and then also training people to give this training. Watching me give it is sort of a prerequisite to becoming a trainer yourself, but part of the reason that we organized this event tonight is to bring trainers to your own community. So if you are interested in being able to present this to your community or your school or whatever it may be, please know that we are very happy to train people to be able to continue giving this. So this PowerPoint and this training is primarily based on US constitutional law, which means no matter where you travel, this stuff is going to apply to it. If there are Oregon-based things that are of note, I will specifically tell you that. Otherwise, assume that what we're talking about tonight applies no matter where you travel. And in fact, all of the rights that we're going to talk about tonight apply whether you are a US citizen or not. If you are present on US turf, all of these rights apply to you as well. Whether you are 8 years old or 88 years old, all of these same constitutional rights apply. We're going to primarily focus on 3 of your constitutional rights. Your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, taking the Fifth. Your Fourth Amendment right, which is your right to privacy, your right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. And then your First Amendment right, which is your right to free speech, to assembly, to protest. And we'll talk about each of those and how they come into this equation. When you see stuff in red on these slides, that is what I was talking about magic words. And we are advising you to memorize these phrases for a couple of different reasons. Number one, these phrases are written in sort of lawyer language. When you say things like, "Officer, what's the reasonable suspicion I'm being detained tonight?" you usually get a different reaction from the police than if you were, just to say, "Well, why the hell did you stop me?" So that's one thing. The other thing is, no matter how many times you have interacted with law enforcement, generally speaking, the adrenaline gets running, you get nervous, and sometimes crazy things come out of people's mouths. If I had $1 for every police report I've had to read where someone has said things that they incredibly regret saying after the fact, I'd be a very rich woman right now. And so by memorizing a phrase, the idea is, even if you're nervous, hopefully this will be what comes out of your mouth instead of something else. So we're going to start with probably one of the most important rights that you have, which is your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. The crux of this is you never, ever, ever have to answer any questions that anyone asks you, ever. The only person that can ever make you answer a question is a judge in a courtroom. And so if you ever think in your head, do I have to answer that? The answer is always no. Now, of course, there can be reasons why you want to answer questions, or why you might call police or talk to police or whatever. But part of the reason that we have this training is to make sure you know where the line is drawn. What is legal and what is not. It's up to you how you want to exercise your own rights. But bottom line is, with the Fifth Amendment, you never have to give any information to law enforcement or to anyone else. That's the Fifth Amendment. Commonly taken the Fifth. And the way that you exercise this right is by saying, I want to remain silent. I want to take the Fifth. And then actually do it. Once you say that phrase, you want to zip it and not keep babbling afterward. Your Fourth Amendment is your right to privacy. The idea that your home is your castle. The Fourth Amendment protects your right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. And so basically what this says is, the cops don't get to come into your house or into your car, into your pockets, into your computer, into your private affairs, unless certain things happen. And the most common way that the state or law enforcement are going to get into your private affairs is because you're going to let them. you're going to consent. The most common way that the police will search people's property is because they consent to it. And obviously, the counter to that is the way you assert your Fourth Amendment right is by saying, I don't consent. Now, in lawyer language, silence equals consent. So if I say, can I search your pockets, and you don't say a thing back to me, you have literally said, yes, Lauren, search my pockets. So whenever you're engaging with the law, you always have to use words. Don't use gestures, and don't think silence protects you. That includes asserting your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, strangely. The other way that police can come into your private domain is by a search warrant or an exception to the search warrant requirement, and we will talk about that in a little more detail. So a search warrant is just a piece of paper signed by a judge. Cop walks into the judge's office and says, I've got this search warrant, I want you to sign it. Judge signs it. That is actually what allows law enforcement to legally enter your home. Once that piece of paper is signed, now if you're home when they arrive, you have the right to inspect the warrant. It should have the date that they're allowed to search, the locations that they're allowed to search, and what they're allowed to take, and then it should be signed by a judge. If you're not home, then law enforcement has the right to enter your home and break down the door and do their business without you being around at all. Now, if you do happen to be home when they show up with a search warrant, we generally advise people, you answer the door and it's the cops, or you hear cops, search warrant. One way or the other, they're coming in at that point. So you may want to, open the door and make sure, whenever you're dealing with police, especially in the modern times, big tip is to just always make sure your hands are visible. Police really want to know where your hands are. Am I reaching in my pockets for a weapon? They don't know. But if your hands are visible at all times, it will really de-escalate their adrenaline as well. So if you're home, cops show up with a warrant, you open the door, make sure they see their hands. They're probably going to make you sit on the couch while they rifle through your underwear drawer. They do have to leave you a list of the items that they have taken if you happen to be present. If you're not present, they have to nail it to the door, basically, when they leave. So that's, and the magic words for exercising your Fourth Amendment right, I don't consent. I don't consent to this search. You always want to say this. We're going to talk about search warrant requirements and things like that. Lawyers, law students go to school for a whole year to learn the Fourth Amendment, and it's always changing, unfortunately, in the bad direction. But by saying the words, I don't consent, if it turns out that what the cop did was illegal, then by saying I don't consent, you've given your lawyer something to fight about for you. If you say I consent, or you shrug your shoulders, or you've just given up the fight. If it turns out that what the police officer did was totally illegal, by you saying I consent, you've given up any fight that you would have had over that. So whatever the reason that they're interacting with you, you always want to say, I don't consent. We're going to talk about, there are certain things the cops are going to be allowed to do. Like if they're lawfully detaining you, they're going to be able to do a pat-down search of me. Even though I know they're going to be allowed to do that, I'm still going to say, I don't consent. We recommend that you say, I don't consent, but I'm not going to resist you, but I don't consent. And you want to kind of say it over and over again. And we'll talk about why that is as well. And then finally, the First Amendment. Everybody thinks of this as the right to exercise your own religion, or the right to protest, the right to free speech. We kind of forget about the right to assemble, which means the right to gather up at your town square, the right to march on the streets, the right for teenagers to stand by a bus station shooting the poop on a Wednesday evening. All of those things, the gathering up of humans to talk about the events of the day or whatever it may be, that too is First Amendment protected. Now, when you're organizing, when you're talking about protests or rallies or demonstrations, your First Amendment rights can be broader or narrower depending on the location. So, for instance, there are things called public forums, like town squares, sidewalks, parks, national forest lands. Those are all quintessential First Amendment public forums, meaning you have the broadest First Amendment rights there. The only way the state can curtail your rights in those circumstances is with this reasonable time, place, and manner test. The flip side of a public forum is a private forum, like my backyard. If all of you showed up to protest my backyard, I can say leave or be arrested for any reason. And if you don't leave, you can be arrested for trespassing, because you don't have any First Amendment rights in a private forum. This, in Oregon, includes malls, parking lots of malls, everything leading up to the Walmart, all of the parking areas, all of their internal sidewalks, those are all private property. Out by the street, the public roadway is usually a sidewalk and a strip of land, and those are actually almost always public land. Right to protest, great there. Step off onto the private parking lot, though, and you can be asked to leave, and if you refuse, you can be arrested for trespassing. So if you are organizing and you're trying to figure out a good place to have your protest, sometimes you need to go look at land use maps and see, where is the public land versus the private land, so that you know where to have people stand, especially if you don't want them to get arrested. And in the middle ground, because this is also a university town like Eugene, quasi-public forums usually relate to things like universities. There could be a town square type place where protest is allowed, but I can't plan on marching into a biology classroom with a sign to protest vivisection and think that I'm going to be able to interrupt that biology class. Generally, the test is if speech would traditionally be allowed there. The soapbox is, the language that the cases usually talk about is, people getting up on a soapbox. If traditional speech was normally allowed there, it's usually a protected public forum, even today. We really self-censor ourselves with regard to the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects nudity. It protects burning the flag. It protects advocating for the overthrow of government, profanity. All of these things are protected by the First Amendment. The second part of this slide is talking about non-U.S. citizens. Like I mentioned to begin with, everybody has the same First Amendment rights when they are on U.S. soil. But if you're here on a visa, like a student visa or a work visa, one of the conditions of that visa was to not engage in political activity. And the same for us when we go to other countries as well. And so if you happen to be a great organizer and now the police would like to shut you up, and you happen to be a non-U.S. citizen, getting arrested at a protest could be grounds for deportation under certain circumstances. So when organizing, especially, and hopefully in this post-Trump environment, as we are building solidarity with targeted communities, think about more vulnerable people that you might be organizing with and inviting, to your events and what their risks may be. With regard to search warrants, do know that cops, and when I use cop as a word, I'm talking about state, federal law enforcement, like anybody with a badge, FBI, TSA, OSU campus police, Benton County Sheriff, you name it, all of them all have to abide by these same rules that we're going to be talking about. And so just for ease, I will usually spit out the word cop, not meaning disrespect, just it's a quick and easy way to say law enforcement. Police can get telephonic search warrants. So for instance, if you look down at the search warrant that just showed up at your house, and it says they can search the house, but it does not say your car, and you look out the window and you see the cop looking through your glove box, you don't want to say, oh, hey cop, the search warrant doesn't say car, because he can get on the phone with the judge and say, oh, I forgot to put car on, will you add car? The judge says, yep, car is added, and that's all they need to do. That's a telephonic search warrant. So just be aware of that. There are a number of exceptions to the search warrant requirement, like I mentioned. One of the more common, if you get pulled over in your car, for speeding, cops are allowed to search your wingspan. which means anywhere that you could reach and grab a weapon, they're going to be able to search only for weapons. So if I had my backpack, they might be able to open up the backpack and look in it for a gun or a knife. They're not going to be able to open up my Altoids tin, because guns and knives won't fit in a little Altoids tin. There are some other exceptions to the search warrant requirement, like for instance, hot pursuit. Cops are chasing a murderer down the street and the murderer runs in my garage. The cops do not need my consent and they do not need a search warrant to run into my private property. Now, once they run into my garage and grab the bad guy, if they look around and see my meth lab, now they're allowed to bust me for the meth lab because of another exception, which is called the Plainview Exception. If it's out in the open and anybody could see it, cops are allowed to see it too. Anywhere the public can go, a cop can go. And anything we can see walking by, I just had to represent a U of O student that stole the High Street sign and nailed it to his wall right in front of the picture windows, and a police officer walked by and looked and saw the publicly owned street sign hanging on his wall. Now he's allowed to enter the home and bust the kid because it was in plain view. The Patriot Act, Trump being elected, all of these things really did take a big hit out of the Fourth Amendment. You might recall, those of you that remember when the Patriot Act was passed, something called a sneak and peek search, which only related to federal agents, not to our local cops, but literally allows law enforcement to come into your home, rifle through your underwear drawer, and leave without ever letting you know they were there. A massive rollback of the Fourth Amendment that has not been repealed yet. So bottom line again, regardless of what they say their rationale is for getting into your private business, you always just want to say, I don't consent. And regardless of who we have as president or what is going on, constitutional rights can't be suspended even during bad times. Okay, so now we're going to turn to dealing with cops on the street and what your rights are. And we break this down into 3 different levels: mere conversation, detention, and arrest. And the reason we break it down like this is because you kind of have different rights and responsibilities for each of these different levels of police encounters. So first, let's start off with some general tips. Like I said, hands. You always want them visible these days. If you are in your car and you get pulled over, put them on the steering wheel. If you're out on the street, slap them down to the sides of your body, just because cops are trained to read your body language. They get a special class on trying to, psychologically profile you and other things like that. If I'm going like this while I'm talking to you, they're trained to think that I'm lying. Fidgeting with your mouth means you're lying. Where your eyes look, the cops know, that's where you hid the evidence, or, something like that. So slapping your hands down at your sides, especially if you're nervous, is a great way to sort of control, what you are giving, what you're communicating to law enforcement. And it lets them chill out a little bit with regard to, fear that all of us are going to shoot and kill them. You also want to, so if you're in your car, by the way, and the cop says, license, registration, proof of insurance, we really advocate that you narrate what you want to do. If I get pulled over, I'm going to say, officer, my license is in my wallet right here. Can I reach in and get my wallet? Yes, do it. My registration is in the glove box right here. Can I open the glove box and get my, just narrate. And if he says, no, don't do that, freeze, Lots of people have gotten shot and killed for being on cell phones, for playing with toy guns, for all sorts of things, especially lately as the police are in fear of us and we're in growing fear of them. Safety becomes even more important in our communities. So hands are a big deal to cops. Try to stay in well-lit places near other humans so that you have witnesses around, especially now with cell phones and citizen videographers chances are if something goes awry while you're interacting with a cop, if you're around people and you're in a lit area, someone may actually film the interaction. You should assume that you're being recorded by the cops, especially if you end up in the cop car. All cop cars are equipped with multiple cameras. One faces out the front hood, one faces into the back seat. Now almost all cops at least have audio recording on their uniform, if not badge cams, which will video record. So I always tell people, imagine grandma sitting on your jury watching this video and act accordingly. Sarcasm does not play well with cops. Saying, oh yeah, I killed that guy, gets written down in a police report as suspect admitted to killing victim, So sarcasm, joking, it's just not a time to impress your friends or try to look cool. We advise you to take a deep breath, get serious, focus on your words, try to get the interaction over with as soon as possible, and then get out of there if you can. You have the absolute right to video record law enforcement. They are public officers doing public duties in public places. There is no right to privacy out in the public domain. That goes for you too, of course. When you're out in public, you don't have a right to privacy. So, in Eugene, we have cameras almost on every street corner at this point. And the reason is, when you're out on the public streets, you don't have a right to privacy, and you can be recorded, but they can be recorded too. If you are recording the police and you happen to be the target of the police's attention, they can tell you stop recording while they're attempting to handcuff you and things like that. And to be clear, you do not want your phone open and accessible if you're about to potentially be cuffed and stuffed. Your phone should be password protected. We just had a judge rule in our favor on a cop watch, a citizen videographer who got beat by the cops, and they took his phone and they took his camera and they looked at the footage and stuff like that. And the federal judge said that your phone is the equivalent of 100 filing cabinets of private information. And in order for law enforcement to be able to access that kind of information, they need a warrant. But we also know that sometimes if your phone is not password protected and they have it in their hands, you cannot ensure that they're not going to look through your most private matters, so make sure it is password protected. If you happen to record something really important, like you just witnessed someone being shot and killed by the police, you want to get that footage off your phone as soon as you can, whether that means uploading it to the cloud, or you've probably heard the articles about people doing like Facebook Live, where they're getting it off their phones, so that if your phone gets destroyed or seized, the footage that you took, that valuable footage, is not going to be lost forever. If the cops say, move back, you can't stand where you are, we generally advise that you take little small steps while you continue to record, and then when they go back to business and forget about you, you just stand right where you were. If they say you have to be across the street, if you don't get across the street, they can arrest you. If they say you have to be a quarter mile away, it might be unlawful, but if you try to challenge it right then and there, you're probably going to end up in the backseat of the cop car. So there is a crime called failure to obey a police order. It's an arrestable offense. You can challenge the legality of that order in court, but you will still get a free trip to the pokey and all of the privileges therein. So that mere conversation stage number one. The police can walk up to any one of you and ask you for your social security number, just like I could. I could walk up to any one of you and say, give me your social security number. And of course you have the right to say, I don't want to tell you that. At the mere conversation stage, cops could walk up to any one of you and say, who's the leader, or where do you hide your jewelry, or anything like that, and you have the right to not speak with them. And we generally advise people to not engage with law enforcement unless there's a specific reason to. Especially in the protest situation, talking to the police at a demonstration is generally relegated to a person who is a police liaison, and we'll talk about that a little later. But you probably don't want to be seen talking to the cops at a protest unless there is a specific reason for it. If the police come up to you and want to talk to you and you don't want to talk to them, we advise that you politely but firmly refuse to speak to them. You say, "Officer, I don't want to talk to you." And then we advise that you slowly walk away. Because at the mere conversation stage, they have no right to hold on to you, no right to hinder your right to travel. If cop comes up to you and you say, "I don't want to talk to you," and you book it and start running away, well, now you've just looked like a sketch ball and you've probably given them some suspicion that might allow them to lawfully hold on to you. So how do you figure out which one of these stages you're at? How do you figure out if you're at conversation or detention or arrest? Well, so as soon as the police walk up to you and say, "Hey, who's the leader of your movement?" you say, "Am I being detained?" And detention is the second one. Am I being detained? Another way of saying this is, am I free to leave? Can I walk away? But again, because we want you to use lawyer words, am I being detained is a yes or no question. If the cop says, "Well, no, you're not being detained, but what are you afraid of? Why won't you talk to me?" That means that there is no suspicion that you've committed a crime. You have the legal right to walk away. Am I being detained? No. Walk away. You have the legal right to walk away. You don't have to tell him your name. You don't have to show him an ID. You have the absolute right to walk away. If police say, you say, "Am I being detained?" and he says, "Yeah, you're being detained," that means that they want to put you in the back seat of a cop car. Now you're on to level 2. So cop walks up to you. First thing you're going to ask them is, "Am I being detained?" A yes or no question. At the detention stage, in order for the cops to be able to hold on to you, they have to have a reasonable suspicion that you have either committed a crime or you're about to commit a crime. That is the only reason that a cop can hold on to you and not let you walk away, that you have committed a crime or are about to commit a crime. Now, reasonable suspicion is more than a hunch. It's more than being a brown person in an all-white neighborhood. It's more than wearing a Standing Rock t-shirt. A reasonable suspicion has to be articulable. They have to be able to tell you. So when you say, "Am I being detained?" and the cop says, "Yeah," the next question you ask is, "Why? Why am I being detained?" The bonus points is, what I was joking with somebody earlier, if you say, "Am I being detained?" and they say, "Yeah," and you say, "Why?" and he says, "Because I said so." That is not an articulable basis to detain you. And the bonus points are saying, "Officer, what is your articulable basis that you're detaining me tonight?" It's a mouthful, but I bet you, I've anecdotally, people have told me that this can really change the dynamic between you and the cops. Once you spit that out, they ask, "Are you a lawyer?" Or they start looking around for like a camera, filming them. So, are you being, am I being detained? Yes. Why am I being detained? And wait for the answer and remember it. Because if they say, "I'm detaining you because we think you burglarized a house," and then you get to court and they're charging you with DUI, with drunk driving, the fact that those two things are different can be a basis to get your charges thrown out, potentially. So make sure you remember, what is it that they're saying? And then don't forget, I don't consent. I don't consent to a search. I don't consent to you touching me. Again, don't resist, because that will potentially add charges to you, like resisting arrest. But it also gives them the green light to use increased force on you. We'll talk about this stuff called use of force, the ability of the police to mace you, shoot you, all of those things. You don't want to give them a reason to be able to use force on you. And resisting them, there is no such thing as a lawful basis to resist a cop, even if if it turns out what they did was illegal. So, if you're stopped by the police, take a deep breath. Get ready. Stay in control of your words and actions. It's not a time to debate. If they say you're under arrest, chances are you're going to jail, and it's not something you can negotiate at that time, usually. You never want to run or physically resist the police, like I said, you will get injured and you will have extra charges against you, even if you think what they're doing is unlawful. If they say you're free to leave, if they say that you're not being detained, get out of there, get out of there. If you're at a rally and the cop sidles up to you and says, I want to talk to you, and you say, am I being detained? And he says, well, no. Don't just stand there next to him, because he's going to come up with a reason to continue to talk to you. So just put a distance between you. And in Oregon, Washington, California, most of the sane states in the country, we are not required to show ID. So in Oregon, as well as like the entire West Coast and places other than Texas and North Dakota and some of the places I have to work in right now, we do not have to show a photo ID ever to the police unless we are the driver of a car and we're getting stopped in our car. So the first thing cops always ask is, let me see your ID. Well, unless you're the driver of a car, you do not have to give them your ID. And there are a few reasons that we advocate to not just whip out that driver's license. Number one, in 2006, a law was passed called the Real ID Act, and it made it almost impossible for undocumented people to get an ID. There are also a number of people in our community that are too poor to get an ID. And by whipping out our privilege when asked, we are putting a specter on those that don't have ID and making it more difficult for them to function in this situation. Number two, if you look on the back of your driver's license, you will see an RFID chip. And this chip, we don't get to know what's on it, it's secret, but it contains all sorts of information. Like on mine, it contains every interaction that I've had with law enforcement. And over 20-something years of being a lawyer and an activist, I am often the police liaison, and I have probably had thousands of contacts with cops. And each one of them is cataloged on this RFID chip. It also says that I am a gang affiliate of the Earth Warriors. And this came about when I represented tar sands blockade protesters down in Texas, protesters that were stopping the Trans-Canada Keystone XL pipeline. A bunch of us that were related to that campaign, Texas did us the favor of letting the feds know that we are gang affiliates of the Earth Warriors. The only reason I know that is I got stopped driving my car in Yellowstone, and a young park police officer had a very hard time seeing gang affiliate and me in the car, and he came back and he was like, what's this gang affiliate? And he actually showed me the computer screen, and I was able to see it, and that's the only reason I know about it. In many states, it has a retina scan. It has, all sorts of information. So the bottom line is, if you don't have to give that over to the cops, don't. If you don't have to give it up, don't give it up to them. That's not to say that if you're pulled over or if you're in, if a cop says, give me your ID or I'm going to arrest you, what they're doing is not legal, but that also doesn't mean that you're not going to jail if you refuse. So there are your rights, and then there is the practicalities of living on the planet, and you have the right to not produce your ID. Under some circumstances, especially for young men of color, you might have to cough up your ID or go to jail. And you're welcome to contact us. We like suing cop shops for violating this law, but you would still potentially go to jail. So again, don't give up your ID unless you really have to, and never consent to a search. So if you are being detained, if the police have this lawful right to detain you, you do have to reasonably identify yourself. You only have to give them 3 pieces of information: name, address, date of birth. Now, of course, you do have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and you don't have to give them those 3 pieces of info, but if you don't, they're allowed to take you down to the cop shop, run your fingerprints, and try to reasonably identify you. So we generally tell people, if the cops say, yes, you're being detained, and only once that has happened, then we tell you, almost volunteer it. Don't wait for them to say, let me see your ID, because then you're going to get into a testosterone debate with this cop about whether you have to do what he says or not. But if they say you're being detained, you should say, my name is this, my address is this, my date of birth is this. Don't give a false name or any false information, because that's a crime, including of your date of birth. Don't give an alias or something like that. If you're transient, that is an address. You are allowed to give it. Police also have to give you their name and their badge numbers and the police agency that they work for. Now, if they are in the middle of running down the street, in an emergency, they don't have to stop and give you a card. They can give it to you in police reports. But if you're on the street and you're at a protest and you ask in a reasonable time period for an officer to identify themselves, by policy, training, and law, they are required to give you that information. If you ever see a cop with his name and badge number covered up with some kind of tape usually, that is not only illegal, but usually means they ain't up to any good. When you see cops with their badges covered up, not a good sign. But if you photograph it or videotape it, we also love to sue cops for that too, and you're welcome to share that with us. At the time that you are detained, the cops now are also allowed to do what's called a pat-down search. This is a pat-down of the outside of your clothing only, and it is only for officer safety. They're only supposed to be seeing, do you have a weapon on you right now that you could hurt them with? It's not looking at your wallet, it's not looking in your Altoids tin, like I said. If I have my backpack on me, they're going to be able to open up my backpack and look in it for that gun or weapon or my purse or whatever. When we give this training to unhoused people, we tell them, as long as your backpack is more than an arm's length away, they no longer have the right to look in there for weapons and stuff like that. So as long as your property is not within your wingspan, it's not subject to this officer's safety search. And I use unhoused people as the example because they are carrying their life, in their backpack often. You want to try to write down everything that you can regarding your police encounter, especially if you're arrested. Your trial, if you get charged with something, might be a year away. Writing down everything while it's fresh in your head will be the best way to keep a strong memory of what's going on. This is always shocking for people, but cops are allowed to lie to you. Absolutely 100% allowed to lie to you while investigating crimes. They can say that they found coke in the trunk of your car, that your mom snitched you out, that they can say anything they want while investigating a crime, and it can be a total outright lie. They can tell you that if you tell them what happened, you won't go to jail or you won't be prosecuted. They don't have any control over whether you're prosecuted. That's for a judge and a prosecutor to decide. So if they really want to promise you something, they will say it in front of your lawyer, and then it may actually be binding. But otherwise, anything a police officer says to you while arresting you and dealing with you may not be true. Now, we give this training to teenagers. We actually run a camp called the Next Generation Climate Justice Action Camp for 14 to 18-year-olds. And I always pause and say, I am not saying that every word out of a cop's mouth is a lie. If you are lost and need directions, you can go ask a cop and they'll probably tell you the truth. But if they are saying you're going to go to jail and they are saying you are involved in a crime, that's when we don't want you to rely on the words that they are saying to you. That's when we want you to assert your Fifth Amendment right, remain silent, wait till your lawyer is with you so that you actually have a witness to what is being said and what is being offered to you. Police cannot move you from the location they found you unless they place you under arrest. So if the cop says, come down this dark alley, we want to ask you a few questions, I do not have to do that unless they actually have said you're under arrest, at which point they can put the fancy handcuffs on me and march me away. At that point, I don't have a control over where they're going to take me. But until that time, I do not have to go with them anywhere. If you are placed under arrest, you want to immediately assert your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and you want to ask for a lawyer. This is called the Invocation of Fifth Amendment rights, and it puts a magic bubble around you that makes it so that the cops are not allowed to question you any further. So you get arrested, you're detained. As soon as you say, I want to remain silent and I want a lawyer, that legally means that the cops must stop questioning you. Now, if you get nervous in the backseat of the cop car and you start blathering about the weather, you've just popped your own bubble. And now they're allowed to start questioning you again. But just by repeating that phrase, I want to remain silent and I want a lawyer, you put the bubble back around yourself again. Again, people under the age of 18 have the same exact rights as adults. But if we as adults are arrested, for minor things especially, we can bail ourselves out, basically. It's called release on your own recognizance. It means that as long as you promise to come back to court, you don't have to pay money, they just let you out, you sign a release agreement, and out the door you go. People under the age of 18 are not allowed to be released on their own recognizance. They have to have a parent or guardian come and physically get them in order to get them out of custody. And so if you and a bunch of folks are heading up to Seattle for some actions and you've got some youth, you want to make sure that mom and dad or guardian have basically signed a permission slip, like a guardianship slip that just says, I, Mary Jo, give Lauren permission to be my kid's guardian for this weekend. That way, if kid gets arrested, I can bring the paper into the jail and get kid out. Otherwise, mom is making the trip from Corvallis to Seattle, very unhappy mom. If you are injured in the course of being arrested, you want to make sure that you are seeking medical attention as soon as you get to the jail. Try to take photographs. If you are on meds or if you have a medical issue, you're going to need to be a real squeaky wheel. Jail medical attention stinks. It's bad. If you have your inhaler or your insulin in your pocket at the time you're arrested, they're not allowed to let you use it. It has to come in through a pharmacy to make sure it's what it is, which means that you could wait, 24 hours in order to get your meds. This is a risk factor if you're an activist and you're thinking about engaging in civil disobedience, or you're thinking about choicefully getting arrested. Make sure that you consider, what are my risks if I get taken to jail? And medical conditions can be one of those that are fairly serious to talk about. One other thing I want to mention while we're talking about in jail. Transgender folks in your community. Right now, if someone is arrested, the jail will house them based on their physical anatomy. It doesn't matter if they've changed their name on their driver's license. If their physical anatomy is female, they're going to be in the female jail. If their physical anatomy is male, male jail. It stinks. Transgender people do have the right to ask to be put in segregation for their own safety if they choose to do that. But that's changing slowly. The federal system is getting much more progressive with it, but state and local, not so much. So police are allowed to arrest you and take you to jail if they have probable cause to believe that you have committed a crime. Probable cause means, again, that it's more likely than not that there is a reasonable suspicion that you have committed a crime. The other way that they can cuff and stuff you is if there's an arrest warrant for you. An arrest warrant is normally issued after you fail to appear for a court appearance. If you are engaging in civil disobedience and you are breaking the law right in front of the cops, they clearly have probable cause to arrest you. Most of the time in civil disobedience actions, especially if people are, sitting down in front of the Bank of America, you will almost always get a warning, what's called a trespass warning. The cops will show up and say, leave or be arrested. Normally they really don't want to haul you to jail, and they'll give you one opportunity to come to your senses and get up and walk away on your own. So if you are engaging in CD, civil disobedience, there will normally be that opportunity for you to walk away if you aren't intending to be arrested. Not always, but most of the time. When you are arrested, they're going to take you off to this secure facility called a jail. And so at that point, they're allowed to do what's called a search to the skin. This is not a strip search. A strip search is where they like look up your orifices. This search is, they make you take off all your clothes, all your jewelry, and they give you jail pajamas to wear for the day because you're about to go be booked into the jail. Now, the reason I mentioned earlier this transdermal piercing thing, and I don't see anybody quickly with transdermal piercings, but when you go to jail, they will make you remove all of your jewelry, wedding rings, nose rings, and often jailers do not know what transdermal piercings are. And for those of you that don't know, it's a piercing that then opens up like a butterfly on the inside of your face, and you can't take it out yourself. You have to have a piercer with a special tool do it. So jailer says, take that out, and you say, I can't. He says, well, you're going to do it, or I'm going to do it the hard way. And we actually had to sue a number of jails for literally taking pliers and ripping people's flesh out because they did not know what transdermal piercings are. So we made this, and we mailed it to every jail in the state of Oregon. And those people with them, we suggest you carry this in your wallet so that if that issue comes up, there's a lawyer that wrote up a little thing on how we love to sue cops for that one too. So that's what transdermal piercings are. At the time that you are arrested, again, like they're going to take everything on you and they're going to put it in a little evidence locker and they're going to look through it and they're going to inventory how much money you have. They're going to rifle through your journal if you're dumb enough to bring that to an action. Anything you've got on you, they're going to be able to rifle through. So, especially if you are intentionally going to a protest, sanitize your car. Take out anything weird, or embarrassing or private in your car. Make sure that you yourself, have looked in the pockets of your old jacket before you get there. You never know what's going to happen. So be better safe than sorry in those circumstances. And again, invoke your Fifth Amendment rights. I want to remain silent. I want to contact a lawyer. Like I mentioned, that puts the magic bubble around you. You have the right to make a reasonable number of phone calls. People think that you get one phone call in jail. Normally you get a reasonable number of phone calls, but there is no rule that says you get to do that within 5 minutes of getting there. It's a reasonable time period, which if you're arrested with 500 people could be 3 days. So don't expect fast action there. But they do have to even give you a phone book if you need it in order to get a lawyer. Very important though, jail phones are always recorded. Always. Even if you're calling your lawyer, don't expect any semblance of privacy. Often, jail cells are video monitored. In actions, in protest actions, often there will be an undercover law enforcement officer in the jail cell with you who acts like he was one of you getting arrested and wants to know all about you and everyone around you and stuff like that. So just know to, keep your lips closed while you're in jail, and the idea is just get out as soon as you can. These are your Miranda rights. You've probably heard them on TV. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Cops do not have to tell you these rights at all. People always ask me, they didn't read me my Miranda rights. Do my charges get thrown out? Absolutely not. Unfortunately, about a decade ago, the Supreme Court ruled that cops don't have to tell you what your rights are. And like I mentioned earlier, because they can lie to you, you probably shouldn't be relying on them to tell you what your rights are, especially when that doesn't help them out much. You being an educated human makes their job harder. So we kind of came up with a more direct, easy to remember version of Miranda rights, which is just don't talk to anyone about anything. You always have the right to say, I don't want to talk to you. The only person that can ever make you talk is a judge in a courtroom. Always have a lawyer present before you talk to anyone. Even if you want to confess, wait till your lawyer gets there so that you have a witness. And, we do go to school for 7 years to learn some of this stuff. It might be good when dealing with serious matters to bring in an expert to help advise you of things. So don't answer any questions or reply to any charges until you've talked to a lawyer and a lawyer is present with you. You might say the sun rises in the east, the cop writes down the sun rises in the west. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe he's trying to hose you. But now it's your word against the cop word which is never a good place to be. So make that lawyer be your witness, if nothing else. Don't perform any tests or consent to any searches, be part of a lineup. The exception to this, though, is when you got your driver's license, you consented to certain DUI field sobriety tests, the non-testimonial ones, which means you don't have to snitch on yourself. You know, this one and walking and balancing and things like that, you know, those don't involve words that make you snitch on yourself, but how many drinks have you had tonight? You don't have to answer that. Doing those field sobriety tests or the breath test, you are required to do that if you have a driver's license. You are not required to do them on a bike, you know, if you don't have a driver's license. But if you get stopped on your bike and they suspect you have DUI and you refuse to do the field sobriety tests and you actually do have a driver's license, they can suspend your driver's license even though you were on your bike at the time. So that's just a little side note. Don't sign anything unless your lawyer tells you to. You know, we've actually had non-English speakers who have signed their own waivers to trials and other things. It should be illegal and isn't. The one thing that we do say you can sign is something called a release agreement. It just says, I promise to come back to court and obey the law. If you don't sign that, they won't let you out. So go ahead and sign that. If it has weird things in it, talk to your lawyer. We can go into court and get the weird things taken out, but go ahead and sign it and get out. And if there's one thing you remember from this training, if you can spit out the words, I don't want to waive my constitutional rights, you have like bare bones covered your butt. Bare bones. Not going to talk much about grand juries, but just know that every felony, whether it is drugs, political, murder, all felonies have to go through a grand jury, which is a secret tribunal. We don't get to, lawyers like me don't get to even go in and watch it. It's just a prosecutor, the grand jurors, and a witness. There's a saying that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. And the reason is, and this actually ties, you know, I'm sure you've probably seen the headlines about all of these grand juries convened about cops who murder humans. Well, the reason that we don't normally see cops indicted for murder is because cops and prosecutors love each other. They work every day together and they're on the same team. And so the prosecutor gets to decide what evidence the grand jury hears. And so if the prosecutor doesn't want you indicted, they might choose not to present certain pieces of evidence. If they want you indicted, they can use hearsay and all sorts of stuff. And it's up to those grand jurors to decide whether felony charges will be filed against someone. And that's the grand jury system. It's gross. A lot of states are giving it up. It came from jolly old England. If you ever get a grand jury subpoena for any reason, contact us. We actually do a separate 1-hour training on grand juries for targeted activist communities. You don't need that. All right, so you're dealing with cops, simple conversations with cops. So a cop walks up to you at that mere conversation stage and says, you know, hi, I want to talk to you. And you say, are you detaining me or am I free to leave? And cop says, well, what are you afraid of? I just want to talk to you. If you weren't doing anything wrong to talk to me. And you say, I choose not to talk to you, and then walk away. Again, you don't have to show your ID. You don't have to give them your name. They're not allowed to pat you down or touch you or anything. You are free to walk away. At the detention stage, it starts off the same way. I want to ask you a couple of questions. You say, are you detaining me? Cop says, now I'm detaining you. At this point, they're allowed to do that pat-down search. I forgot to mention, you are entitled to a person of your own gender to do that search. Now, if you happen to be out in Eastern Oregon where there ain't a female cop for 100 miles, a male cop will search you as a female. But you have the right to ask, and very often, if there are ones available, they will, bring them in to do these types of searches. I jokingly tell people that, the more female officers we have, I think the better maybe the temperament might be. So the more times females ask for a female officer to do these searches, maybe the more of them will be hired. And don't forget to ask, why am I being detained? And remember to memorize what they say. At that detention stage, as we talked about, now you have to give name, address, date of birth. No ID unless you are the driver of the car. And then at the arrest stage, you want to invoke your Fifth Amendment rights. You want to remain silent, and you want a lawyer, and then you want to zip it. Your rights at airports, you basically don't have any. Next. Your rights, and airports, by the way, airport means once you go onto airport property in your car. It's not once you get into the terminal. It is as soon as you go on airport property, they can pull you over, search your trunk, et cetera, et cetera. And borders, a border region is 500 miles. 500 miles. And there are greatly reduced constitutional rights in these areas. Like, for instance, they can normally, in order to get into the trunk of your car, that's not in my wingspan, so they need a warrant to look in my trunk. But within 500 miles of a border, they can potentially look in your trunk because you might be sneaking humans in the country. So just know that, and with Trump coming into office, God knows what this is going to look like. So this area of the law is really changing fast. Well, and the interesting thing is, often they claim that coastal areas are a border line. So we are certainly 500 miles from the Oregon coast. Yeah. Most of this is happening on the Canadian border and, of course, on the Mexican border. We haven't seen this invoked in Oregon, for instance, but it's certainly available.
Is that just talking about national borders or state borders?
National. Thank you. Yeah, national borders. Yeah.
Can just any cop do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Most, in Oregon, well, let me back that up. In Oregon, we are so lucky. We actually passed a specific Oregon state law that says our state and local cops shall not act as immigration cops. And they are not allowed to ask about status. They're not allowed to do anything like that. We had to sue some Eastern Oregon cops for forgetting that. But ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, or other federal agents, certainly can. But in places like Arizona, they have deputized all of their state and local cops to be immigration cops. Oregon passed that law to have safe communities so that everyone feels safe to call law enforcement if they need help. Otherwise, who's going to do that? So I'm going to really skip a little bit of this. I was not asked to do an immigration rights training. Do know that we give them, and if anyone ever wants one, we'd be happy to come back and do it. One thing I do want you to know, though, about immigration law, if somebody gets picked up on a deportation warrant and is being held pending deportation, this process is taking about 2 years from start to finish. The person is arrested, they're transported to Tacoma or one of these private corporate jail facilities that I'm sure you've read about, and then they wait 2 years for the process to actually put them on a bus and take them back to their country of origin. In Oregon and in most states, after 6 months, their parental rights are terminated and their children are put up for adoption or put into the foster care system. And so we strongly advocate that undocumented families come up with a safety plan. If they come up with an agreement, and we have these and we share them all the time, that says, in the event something bad happens, Lauren Regan is the legal guardian of my children. I can go to ICE and get those kids and take them home. And then Mom and I probably had a conversation that now my job is to put them on a bus and get them to Grandma in Mexico. Give the parents the right to choose what happens to their children in the event that something like that happens. So if any of you do work with immigrant communities, please talk to me afterward or contact us. We've got lots of resources to try to prevent that incredibly harsh consequence that not many people know about with regard to the deportation system. Now, there are a few facilities in Arizona that are putting moms and kids in jail together, horrifying as that is. But most of the time, if mom gets picked up during a workplace raid, for instance, and the kids are at school, that's when these circumstances roll out.
It's my understanding, and perhaps you can clarify for us, the law you mentioned that makes Oregon, keeps Oregon police from cooperating with immigration services is supposedly under attack. Will be sued for the next state. And maybe, perhaps you can help out.
Well, what I can tell you, there is an organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's made up of these multinational big bad corporations, including several that build prisons, make prison mattresses, and all sorts of things like that. Oregon is the third largest recipient of ALEC money in the country. We are behind California and Arizona for these dollars. And it is specifically regarding fossil fuel infrastructure, primarily oil and gas and exports and stuff like that. But the other is that we have passed progressive legislation like ORS 133. And yeah, with the racist climate that we are currently about to deal with, a number of Oregon state laws are under attack. And I have heard that there are bills pending, but there are bills pending all the time, and none of them usually get out of committee. So we'll see. We're definitely keeping our eyes on it, but I would not panic yet. We've seen this attack happen for the last 6 years in a row. One other thing, if you are working, ICE, the La Migra, or the Immigration Customs Enforcement, unlike cops, they can't just enter your home. Even if they have a deportation warrant for someone, they can't just bust down the door and enter. They have to knock and be let in. And so we always, when we give this immigration training, we teach people, you can just ignore the door and they cannot come in. You could even tell them, slip the papers under the door, read them, slip them back out, and then tell them to go away. And they don't have to, they can stake your house out, of course, for days on end, waiting for you to leave for work, but they can't just enter. All right, so we're not going over this, don't worry, but this is your legal flow chart. From the moment you choose to stay on the train tracks rather than leaving as you were asked, getting arrested, going through the bail process. We're not here to talk about, this is not, if I'm asked to give these trainings at action camps where like hundreds of people are about to go get arrested, we go through this in a little more detail, but I will not bore you with that right now. And so with that, we are on to questions and answers, or hopefully answers.
So you got a bad cop and he doesn't follow the rules or the laws. He says, I'm arresting you. And you say, why? He says, because I don't like the way you look. The bottom line is you got to follow his orders, right? And sue him after you get out, if you get out.
Yeah, yes, for the most part. If the cop is going to say that, yeah. And we generally tell you not to try and debate and argue at that point, because every word you say, will potentially be used against you. Of course, again, if you can, citizen videography, has really changed the universe of police misconduct litigation. I've done it for 19 years, and it was always really hard because the cops would say one thing and the citizen who got beat up would say another thing. But now we've had all of these, camera, footage that has come forward and really sort of painted the police more in line with, how I have had to deal with them in litigation. So, yeah.
You were saying with search warrants, if it's physically handed to you, check to see if there's a judge's signature. But then you talked about telephonic warrants. How do I differentiate a telephonic warrant from a line?
You can't. They do have to, if you were charged with a crime, then the state has to give you discovery, which means all the police reports and stuff, and you're entitled to a copy of, what time did the cop call, what judge was it, why was the basis, there's sort of a transcript of it after the fact. But all you can do is just basically, let them see your hands and not resist and assume that what they're saying. But, if they say, we've got a telephonic warrant, we're going to search your car, you still want to say, I don't consent. I'm not going to resist you, but I do not consent. And say it over and over. You know, I jokingly tell people, like, we know there is a camera in the front of that cop car. Stand in front of the mirror and be like, I don't consent. You know, just so that there's a very clear record.
So on a bike, if you're pulled over for suspicion of DUI, can you refuse or deny having or showing an ID, a driver's license?
Well, if you are being reasonably detained, they will require you to give name, address, date of birth.
Okay.
And so if they run your name and it comes up with a driver's license, they know you've got a license.
If I'm in my car, and can I give them a passport instead of my driver's license?
Did you say you're driving?
If I'm not driving.
Oh, if you're not
Can I
driving.
use my passport instead, and does that not have, I mean, is that better than this RFID?
Well, if you're not driving, you shouldn't be coughing up any kind of photo ID. If you have to because they are forcing you to or they're threatening you with arrest, then showing your passport certainly reasonably IDs you. Of course, it also shows your country of origin, which is something that law enforcement is never allowed to ask. Cops, no matter where you are in the cop system, they're not allowed to ask country of origin and they're not allowed to ask for social security number. So you never should ever give that information.
But I'm privileged, and I am an American citizen, I'm a privileged folks with a passport. Does it have the same kind of information that RFID has on it?
There is a chip or a strip on it. I have not heard the same level of detail about what is contained on that. I would guess it's similar, although maybe they don't care that I'm an Earth Warrior gang.
I'm going to be at the Million Women's March in DC with my family, and I'm wondering if there's anything to be aware of, particularly for safety, or you know, just hear about a peaceful protest and then a few people get rough, and then what can transpire or what to be aware of.
Sure. So we'll go into this a little bit more with the legal observer training, but these days, what I would say for mass demonstrations like that, you want to have earplugs in case what's called long-range acoustic devices, LRADs. I always have goggles in the event that like tear gas starts flying and you need to get out of there. Usually, you know, you can read the crowd a little bit. And like I mentioned before, if something is going to be shut down and you're no longer allowed to be somewhere, they're going to make a big announcement over these LRADs
So you
saying,
generally will have a cue if
Yeah.
something is going to
yeah,
fall.
I mean, you definitely want to be aware. You know, a protest march, even though it's legitimate and safe and all sorts of things, you know, it's not a parade, right? And so you really do want to be aware of your surroundings. You want to keep yourself and others safe. Yeah, and you never, like you said, you never know, but 98% of the time things go the way you want them to go. And
Like
you
I
should
said,
enjoy
part of
yourself.
what I wanted to know is that there's generally some signal before these forms of force are used.
Yes, although the caveat to that is if you are 5,000 people wide and somebody at the front is making an announcement, you are very unlikely to hear it. You know, so
Just be aware.
yep. Just circling background. Yeah.
Earlier, you talked about once you're detained and you're asking why. You said a phrase that I didn't see written on any of the things. You said something about
Articulable suspicion.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Articulable suspicion.
And that just means you have to tell me why I'm being detained.
Okay.
But
And then the other question, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The other question I got is, how do you dovetail, like, let's say, the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center and other organizations like that? Because it sounds like there's some overlap with some of these. So can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. We are a very small group, founded and only based in Eugene. There's only 2 lawyers right now, and we are much more responsive. We don't have a huge bureaucracy. We do a lot of activist defense and activist know your rights trainings for movements and for pre-action, pre-demo. And then we do a lot of police and government misconduct, usually for people who have hard times finding lawyers. Like we specifically work with communities of color, rural, poor communities, communities that basically have hard access to lawyers. And like I mentioned, right now we have a couple hundred criminal cases out at Standing Rock. We're the lawyers on the class action there. We represent the 52 Break Free activists up in the Seattle area, as well as all of the valve turners. Right now it's mostly climate oriented, but it was Black Lives Matter, it was Occupy before that, like basically anything left of center we strongly support. And we do a lot of intersectional work, so we do a lot of cross-movement organizing, which is why we do immigrant rights, we work in Muslim communities, we work with GLBT communities. So we are very distinct from those, primarily because we do criminal defense. Neither of those groups actually represent activists. And generally, I think people would tell you that we might be a little bit more on the radical end of the left spectrum. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Several of the progressive leaders in the community have called for a community gathering on January 20th to fight back the politics of fear as a positive statement, and we're choosing not to get a permit, and we have an ordinance in this town that says if we stay on the sidewalk, we don't need a permit.
Okay.
Do you have anything to say about, I think earlier on you were referring to permits or not.
Well, okay, so, you have a First Amendment right to be on that sidewalk regardless of permits or not. And generally, our position is that you should not ask the state for permission to exercise your First Amendment rights. However, some things like over a certain size, or if you're using a PA, they could potentially use that as a basis to shut down your demonstration. And if you're inviting families and other people to the event, you want to make sure that the event goes off. And there can be, a balancing of whether you need to ask permission or not. The saying, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. That's generally the way we work it. Sidewalks, I would not care about at all. Streets, can get a little dicier unless you have the numbers to really hold a public street. But fees for permits, there's great case law on waiving, money that they make you pay for those permits, or pay for cops or other things like that.
That was part of the problem. They want a responsible person. They want liability insurance.
Yeah, they don't get that usually.
Okay, they don't get it. Okay.
Didn't hear that from me, right, live stream?
Okay.
Yeah, you can try and
we
negotiate.
have no idea how many people in the community come.
You can try and negotiate it. It's always dicey, especially if you're the organizer. It's a real catch-22, because you are going to be responsible for people coming to your event, and you want them to be safe and non-arrestable unless that's their, unless they consent to that. Yeah.
So, given the fact that you have an Oregon law that says there must be a lawful police order, it sounds like passive resistance is gone.
It's still in the statute that going limp, literally going completely limp, is not resisting arrest. So there is a statute, a crime of resisting arrest, which basically means if I don't automatically go like this and put my hands behind my back, I'm resisting. If I tense up my arms, if I put them like this, if I do anything to stop them from easily putting my hands in handcuffs, that can be resisting arrest. But in Oregon, we have a defense to resisting arrest, which is called passive resistance, which is if you go completely limp, or if you happen to be locked down to something with a piece of metal of some kind, then that is not resisting arrest. It could be disorderly conduct, it could be trespassing, it could be different things, but it's not resisting arrest. And that's important because, for protest purposes, getting a disorderly conduct charge or a trespassing charge, slap on the hand usually, baby pants stuff. But resisting arrest, if you're convicted of that comes up on your record and cops think you're a fighter. And then they immediately get to accelerate the use of force based on that conviction. So it's an important one to try to keep off people's records.
specifically around gangs, that groups of 6 or more are not allowed to walk the streets together because it's considered gang activity. So how,
Why? Why does that
well,
happen?
and how is that allowable if we have the right to gather?
Right.
So-
So the question is, some places have these gang ordinances. If 6 or more teenagers gather at a bus stop, it's a crime. It's a gang crime. And why? Why is that allowed when you have a First Amendment right to assemble? And I wish that I had, this happened before my time. I wish I was a lawyer at that time. But what the courts ordered in that case is that this was a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction because of public health and safety. That these people are so likely to be a safety risk to the community that we can restrict their rights by saying 6 or more of them. It's the same with like prostitution zones and all sorts of things. In protests and mass protests, like at the RNC, Republican National Convention, DNCs, we now have a little small cage in a chain link fence called our free speech zone. We're not allowed to protest these things anymore unless we're in the cage, and then we can show each other our signs because we all agree while everyone else, The reason that we've gotten to that point is because the state basically said, well, gosh, we keep having these protests and 4 people do bad things and they're violent terrorists. So for health and safety reasons, we think it's a reasonable time, place, and manner to take them out of the public forum and put them in the small cage to protest. And the courts have said, go for it. And that's why we are stuck with that at this point. Circling, yeah.
In your commentary a few minutes ago about other legal, potential legal help, you did not mention the National Lawyers Guild. What is their presence in this area?
So here in Corvallis, I don't think there is much of a presence, hence why I'm here to do a legal observer training afterward. Eugene and Portland both have chapters.
Do you work in consort?
Yeah, I'm the Eugene contact for the NLG, and they have a website, nlg.org. But they're kind of like an umbrella, if a case comes and I'm handling it, NLG will report on it and stuff like that. It's sort of like a listserv of lawyers, in essence.
They're not actively defending protesters?
There's no such thing as like an NLG staff attorney. All there are lawyers like me who volunteer and might voluntarily take on a case in the NLG's name. And they organize legal observers, which we'll talk about next. Yeah.
Yeah, so just recently I watched a video that had interview or interrogation where police gave he started telling him the Miranda Rights and that sort of thing. And he got to a point where he said, well, I would like to be a lawyer. And the police decided to say to him, well, we're not going to provide you a lawyer. You have to do that yourself. And that made him kind of say, well, I can't afford a lawyer and I don't know how to do that. And they kind of like pretty much almost like tricked him to thinking that, well, because I can't do it myself, I can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically it kind of made him start talking during this interrogation. I was just wondering, are police allowed to basically influence you verbally to the point where you feel like you can't like stop down and say, hey, I need a lawyer and that's it? There's this tendency where
Sure.
psychology, I guess.
Sure. So 2 different things on that. So number 1, like I said, cops are allowed to lie.
Yeah.
They can bully you. They can interrogate you for days. They do it to mentally disabled folks. They'll go hog wild if you let them, and that's generally allowed unless you said I want to remain silent and I want a lawyer.
Yeah.
If you spit those words out, then that has to stop. The other part of the thing, though, is everyone is entitled to a court-appointed attorney if they can't afford a lawyer. The thing is that in Oregon, you have to be brought in front of a judge within 48 hours of being arrested. In California, Washington, it's 72 hours. Usually 72 is the longest that you'll have to wait. You go to court to be arraigned in front of the judge, your first appearance in front of the judge, and that's when you apply for a court-appointed lawyer. So often, you won't actually have a lawyer. You know, if you can't afford one of your own, often you have to wait until this first court appearance to have access to counsel. And so people just need to know, even if you want to confess or you want to work with the cops, you need to wait until you're brought in front of the judge for the first time, get a lawyer, and then that lawyer represents you for free if you need it.
And so the cops are now, I mean, can they lie about that, or?
Yeah, they can lie about anything. I mean, especially if
Yeah.
they're really digging for something. You know, like kidnapped kids comes to mind. You know, I mean, there are occasions where I've watched interrogation videos that were unbelievable. You know, especially if you go back to like the Black Panther era. You know, I mean, there were some incredible historic things that have been videotaped with regard to police interrogations. And yeah, it's legal until you say, I want a lawyer, I want to remain silent. And as soon as you do that, if they continue to ask you questions and they continue to interrogate you, nothing that comes out of your mouth will be usable in court. And so especially the feds or any cop that actually knows what they're doing, if they think they have an actual case, they're not going to blow it by bullying you into talking after you've invoked your rights, because they're making their whole case go down the toilet. So usually when you see that type of bullying and interrogation, it's because they don't know if they have anything.
So I was at Standing Rock, and they had us put the phone number of legal counsel on our arms. Would you suggest we take that with us when we go through? If we're going to be in a direct action of some sort, should we have a lot of lawyers lined up ahead of time to call?
Well, so the number that you had on your arm was actually the jail support number, not the lawyer number. And we'll talk a little bit about what jail support is in the next training, but just in case people aren't hanging out for that, you usually have one person who becomes the jail support person, and that phone number is given out to everybody who's going to go to a demo, whether they want to get arrested or not. And in the event that something happens, either unexpected or an emergency while you're in jail or whatever, that is the phone number you call to get word out if you need it. And yeah, I generally recommend, if you are planning a civil disobedience action where you are thinking people might get arrested, it is always good for your campaign or your movement to buy some lawyers lunch and talk them up and get them to at least generally say, you know, you never ever want to tell a lawyer, I'm going to break the law next Thursday. Because we are actually like officers of the court. We're supposed to be required to rat you out in that circumstance. But you could say, there's going to be a demonstration next Thursday at blah, 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 blah. Would you be available for consultation, or, you know, if people are arrested? And then they say yes or no. You put together a stable of them, or, you know, what CLDC often does for large actions like Break Free and Shall Know, we come in to coordinate legal support. So we actually come in and help find the lawyers for everybody after the fact. So there's different ways that you could do it. I'd be happy to talk to you about it more afterward. But the long and short of it is, yeah, if you're planning an action where you think a bunch of people are going to get arrested, you need to figure out what your legal strategy is, just in the same way you need to figure out your exit strategy and your media strategy and everything else. You don't want to launch a bunch of cannon fodder at the cops and then leave them to fend for themselves, because they're going to have a bad experience and then they're going to leave your movement and never come back. Yeah.
How is your work support? You mentioned several times that you do free work. How many people support that?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, about 90% of our money comes from individual donors and organizational members. So like some 350s and some other groups are organizational members, but the overwhelming majority of our money comes from individuals. The best way to support us is by being a monthly donor, even if it's just $5 a month, because then we have a nice steady supply. You know, like sometimes, you know, like with Standing Rock, you know, everybody gets all riled up about Standing Rock, but my work is going to go on for the next 2 years. You know, while the headlines are down and everybody's moved on to something else, I'm still flying into Bismarck on a weekly basis for court appearances. So the monthly donations allow us, you know, a little more stable sense of financial security. So that's one easy way. But we also love volunteers, you know, coming in and helping us, you know, do stuff and organizing house parties, or, you know, there's all sorts of different things people can do. I forget what the name of it is, but like your equivalent of Saturday Market here, like the Farmers Market has like a once a month concert thing, and we've been recipients of those donations in the past. And a number of donors come from Corvallis already, so it's usually the best way. And then to finish the answer, when we sue cops and win, they have to pay our attorney fees. And so I'll work for 5 years to sue the cops, and then I will send them a very large bill, and they have to pay it, and we stick it in the bank and live off it for a year. Yeah?
You mentioned 48 hours in terms of getting to a court. That doesn't include weekends or holidays, does it?
Yes. Yeah, the reason it's 48 hours, yeah, the question was, does 48 hours include holidays and weekends? The reason it is 48 hours is because if you get arrested on a Friday, you're going to go to court on a Monday, and it's, you know, roughly 48 hours. Also, jails can do arraignments on weekends, you know, and at nights if needed, especially for, you know, potentially people with diagnoses of mental illness and other things like that. So, yep, it really is 48 hours. And if they can't arraign you in that time, they have to let you go.
So, hanging on that question, you go to the grocery or something unexpected happens, you get arrested, you don't have an attorney, but you make a phone call, you know, somebody else advocates for you to find it. Is the attorney forced the arraignment required 48 hours, or do you have to wait for that arraignment to occur at that point?
Usually, if you do have an attorney, you know, they're going to come to the jail and meet you and tell you what's up and stuff. The reason that sometimes lawyers can't expedite the arraignment process is because we have to wait for the prosecutor, the district attorney, to actually file the complaint, that charging instrument. And if that hasn't been filed, there's no case for you to be arraigned on yet. So the state has 48 hours to get that filed, basically, is what's going on.
And does the attorney have any way to shorten that process, or is that just tedious?
No, not usually. But that doesn't mean that you can't get released on your own recognizance or bailed out in the interim. So you can get out of jail sooner. It's just they have up to 48 hours to get that paperwork filed, and you can't be arraigned in front of a judge without that paperwork filed. Sometimes it can be fast, you know, but not always.
So say you get arrested and you're in jail, what's the best way to get medical attention, say if you need it, or to get a phone call? Because typically those things aren't just handed out.
Yeah, so with medical care, you just really have to repeatedly ask for it every single time that a guard walks by you. There's also a system of correspondence in jail called the Kite System, K-Y-T-E, and it's little slips of paper, and you write, "I'm dying, I need medical attention," and that gets sent, you know, back and forth, and it's put into your file, and that's how you can document that you're making the requests. But really all you can do is just repeatedly ask and tell them what the consequences are. You know, if I don't get my insulin in the next 2 hours, I will lose consciousness. You know, usually if it's for a minor thing, like an activist related crime, usually means they're going to pop you out of jail before they have to deal with you. So often it's a way to expedite your exit from custody. But if it's for a more serious situation, or you're in North Dakota, it won't matter.
So how?
I have a broader question. Is there anything in this would you do this presentation differently for people of color? Would the kind of words and the advice you give for interactions change at all?
No. No, the words and the advice definitely would not change. I do usually go in a little bit more about, like, I understand this is the law, but this may not be the practice. And I also go into like how to report police misconduct and racial profiling. We actually do an entirely separate training on police misconduct and racial profiling. I also talk about some common situations that sometimes happen, like especially with like young men of color. They get stopped for speeding and all of a sudden they're meant to like sit on the ground like a dog. The courts have ruled that's okay because they might flee and cops, you know, that eat donuts can't chase them fast enough or something. And so there are some circumstances, like court cases that have come up that I will usually emphasize a little bit more when I'm in those communities. But all of these same rights and especially using the magic words are almost more important. And when we do these trainings in immigrant communities and undocumented communities, even though we do the presentation in Spanish, we'll actually have them memorize the magic words in English, because with workplace raids, for instance, being able to say, am I being detained, might get you out of the room, just so that you can get out and not be part of everyone else that's going to be deported. So yeah, we do it similar.
I was just curious, is it a common occurrence that the indictment isn't filed in 48 hours?
So an indictment is for a
The
felony.
paperwork,
A complaint is for a misdemeanor.
Okay.
Complaints will be filed usually within 48 hours, or they're going to let you out and tell you to come back.
Oh.
So like sometimes, especially in Oregon, especially Benton County and Lane County, you might show up for your arraignment and they'll say it's a no file or it hasn't been filed yet. And what that means is they're not sure if they're going to prosecute you or not. And usually what happens is you then walk up to the DA's office and give them your name and phone number, and they call you when they decide to charge you, and they invite you back. Or they'll issue a warrant for your arrest. So generally speaking, yeah, they're going to get it done within 48 hours. The felony preliminary system is different than that, though.
Yeah, I'm involved in networking. I'm working with several different groups, PCBs for West Oregon, Revolution Lane County, primarily IPA, Mama Falls 3, organized by Lisa Ortiz, who's already sponsored 9 trips to Standing Rock since September for supply runs. And basically what we're trying to do is find out what you and other legal organizations are doing for networking, so that all these groups can have some kind of universal tie-in. And we're going to have an event, obviously, every quarter on 15th, and on the 20th for inauguration. And obviously, in Trump World, we're going to have several different things, several different movements, rallies, and big marches going on over the next few years. And what my job is right now is to try to go ahead and find out how we can go ahead and network and tie in the different groups so that we all have some way of contacting each other and supporting each other. And your group is really important, and this is exactly what we need to do going forward. So if there's any way we can network and make sure that everybody is kind of connected somehow and has somebody to get to, so that we can keep fighting for progressive values.
Great. Well, my contact info is back there.
Question from the live stream audience. Is it okay to throw your backpack to get it out of arm's reach?
Yeah, technically, it is. We generally advocate the sort of slow drop and move away because it's a little less sketchy. There is nothing illegal about trying to toss it away. But, the problem is if they were going to actually arrest you, they're going to grab that backpack and take it to jail with you, and then they're going to be able to rifle through its contents. Anything else? Yeah, in the back.
I had a friend who had a funny experience. They signed the wrong document when they went to the courthouse to ask for a public defender. Somehow they accidentally signed it, they waiving the right to a lawyer. And so I suggest people read documents that they file or write on before they sign it.
Yeah, and do know that you always, whether you're dealing with police or the court system, you always have the right to an interpreter of your native language. So even if you speak some, Oaxacan dialect, they actually have to get an interpreter on the phone and give you the phone and interpret in your native language. Whether you have low reading skills or whatever it may be, make sure that you really understand what you're getting into. And know that lawyers can advise you, but the final decision on your case is yours. Lawyer, you're the boss of your lawyer. You can hire and fire a lawyer, even if it's court appointed and free. And the lawyer is you're the boss of that person. And so make sure that you know exactly what you're doing before you do it, because the consequences are obviously serious.
Just a quick question, can the interpreter lie?
No,
You know what I
no.
mean?
A
Like,
certified,
if the cop is lying and the interpreter is just saying what he's saying or she's saying, you know what I mean?
right, yeah, so here's the hard part, like, real interpreters, which we definitely, if you're stopped and you don't speak English, don't use your 15-year-old kid, make them provide a real interpreter because they are certified, they take an oath, but what they took the oath to do is to translate every word that is being said. So if the cop is lying, they are going to translate the lie words out to you. And the harsh part is that then, this Spanish-speaking person immediately wants to have affinity with this other Spanish-speaking person. And so now all of a sudden they hear the interpreter saying this, and they don't necessarily realize that it is word for word what the cop said. And so now they're going to believe it because it's coming from the Spanish-speaking interpreter, and it's harsh. We go over it in depth when we do our immigrant rights training because it comes up a lot in that circumstance. We really go over what is an interpreter. But yeah, it is scary.
Do you have the right to have a copy of all the paperwork that's involved in your arrest?
Yes, we do. Yeah, your lawyer has a duty to provide you with that if requested. Yep. All right. So it is 6:47. So I guess we're gonna take, like a 15-minute break, and we'll come back at 7 o'clock. So before